On the 23rd of October, 1929, a group of engineers assembled inside the 65th floor of an unfinished skyscraper on Lexington Avenue and began raising a secret. They had built it in 4 sections: a stainless steel spire 185 feet tall, fabricated from a German alloy that had never been used at this scale in American architecture. For weeks they had assembled it in the dark, inside the building's own frame, hidden from the street and from every competing architect in the city. Now, in 90 minutes, they hoisted it through the open top of the dome and riveted it into place. The building went from 925 feet to 1,046 feet in an afternoon. The next morning, October 24th, the New York Stock Exchange opened and began to collapse. The Chrysler Building claimed the title of tallest structure on Earth. The day before the decade that built it fell apart. The crown of American industrial ambition was placed at the precise moment that ambition was about to cost everyone who held it everything they had. That timing was not a metaphor anyone planned. It was just what happened, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. The architect who designed the spire would never design another significant building. The man who paid for it built it as a monument for his children, and his children sold it 13 years after he died. The corporation whose name is on the facade moved out within a generation. The building passed through foreclosure, through a sovereign wealth fund that paid $800 million for it, through a fire sale at $151 million, and through a legal war with a university that has owned the dirt beneath it since 1902 and has quietly outlasted every owner who ever believed the building was theirs. The Chrysler Building is the most recognized silhouette on the Manhattan skyline. It has been owned in one form or another by more than a dozen different entities across a century. Not one of them has ever owned the ground it stands on. This is the story of what it costs to build something that outlasts you. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing where this channel reaches, and we get viewers from places that genuinely surprise me every week. If you're new here and this is the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. We cover the full stories behind buildings like this one and the people who built them regularly. Now, before we talk about the building itself, we need to talk about the ground it stands on, because that ground has been the source of every fortune made here and every fortune lost. In 1902, Andrew Carnegie donated a plot of land at the corner of 42nd Street and Lexington Avenue to a private college called Cooper Union. He was not being sentimental. He was being strategic. Cooper Union had been founded in 1859 by Peter Cooper, inventor, industrialist, designer of America's first steam locomotive, and a man who believed that education should be available to anyone regardless of race, gender, or income. Cooper had funded the institution primarily through real estate holdings, arranging for the rents and tax revenues from his properties to flow directly to the school in perpetuity. When he died, the mission survived him. When his descendants and Andrew Carnegie donated the 42nd and Lexington corner in 1902, they were extending the same logic. Find a piece of New York that would only become more valuable with time, attach it permanently to the school, and let the city's own growth pay for free education indefinitely. What they chose was a trapezoid at the intersection of two streets that would soon anchor the eastern edge of Midtown Manhattan. Grand Central Terminal was 1 block west. The city's center of gravity was moving north. The land was not just an endowment. It was a bet on where New York was going. There is one additional curiosity about that plot. It predates the commissioner's plan of 1811, the grid that gave Manhattan its orderly geometry. The old Boston Post Road ran a slant of that grid, and the property line followed it. As a result, the east wall of whatever building went up there would be slightly crooked relative to every other building on the block. The Chrysler Building sits at a gentle slant to the Manhattan street grid to this day, for reasons that have nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with a colonial-era road that no longer exists. Cooper Union's charter gave it a specific arrangement with the city. Endowment properties were tax-exempt under an 1859 law, not partially exempt. Entirely. Not a single dollar in property taxes from the Chrysler Building has ever reached New York City. Instead, every owner of the building has paid the equivalent of those taxes directly to Cooper Union, as rent for the land beneath their feet. The city tried to repeal the exemption multiple times across the building's history. The courts blocked it each time. The arrangement has held for over a century. For 19 years after the 1902 donation, the land sat undeveloped, generating modest rental income from whatever occupied the corner in the interim. In 1921, a developer named William H. Reynolds signed a long-term lease and announced plans to build something worthy of the location. Reynolds was not a man who thought small. He had built Dreamland, the most elaborate amusement park on Coney Island, in 1904, a fantasy of electric lights and architectural spectacle that burned to the ground in 1911 and was never rebuilt. He had served in the New York State Senate. He had made and lost fortunes with the particular energy of a man who found the making more interesting than the keeping. He understood spectacle the way a showman understands it, not as decoration, but as the point itself. By the mid-1920s, he had settled on a vision for 42nd and Lexington, the tallest building in the world, crowned with a glass and metal sphere that would glow at night like a jewel above the city. He hired an architect named William Van Alen in 1927 to design it. Van Alen's original proposal featured showroom windows, tripled in height at the base, 12 stories of glass-wrapped corners above them, creating the impression that the tower floated free of the ground, and Reynolds's insisted upon metallic crown that would look, in the developer's description, like a great jeweled sphere at night. The plans were approved in June of 1928. Van Alen's drawings were published in an architecture journal that August. By October of that year, Reynolds had run out of money. He sold everything to Walter Chrysler for approximately $2.5 million. The lease, the land rights, the building plans, the architect's services. The whole proposition, intact, transferred on October 15, 1928. The Goodwin Construction Company began demolishing what Reynolds had managed to build that same day. Reynolds took his money and left. The man who replaced him had no interest in glass spheres or jeweled crowns. Walter Chrysler wanted something the whole country could see from the street, and he already knew exactly what it should look like. Walter Percy Chrysler was born on April 2, 1875 in Wamego, Kansas, the third of 4 children of a locomotive engineer named Hank Chrysler, who drove trains for the Kansas Pacific Railroad through country where buffalo still grazed the prairie and arriving cowboys from Texas cattle drives mobbed the saloons of Ellis, the small Kansas town where the family settled before Walter turned 4. Hank Chrysler carried a 6-shooter on the job. Winter snow blew through the cracks around the windows of their 2-room wooden house. The nearest thing to luxury in Ellis was the railroad depot, and even that was modest. Walter grew up watching his father's hands on machinery, and decided early that was what he wanted. His father wanted him in college. He was the first Chrysler who might go, and Hank pushed for it with the particular intensity of a man who understood what credentials could do. At 15, Walter had had enough of school. At 17, he started an apprenticeship in a railroad machine shop against his father's explicit wishes, and spent the next 2 decades moving from shop to shop across the American West, Wellington, Denver, Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, Pittsburgh, developing a reputation as the fastest man at valve setting and plant efficiency in any building he entered. He moved when a better opportunity appeared, or when his temper made staying awkward, or simply when restlessness took him. He was rarely in the same city for more than a few years. He collected knowledge the way other men collected money. Every shop he entered, he understood its operations before he tried to change them. Every machine he touched, he wanted to know why it worked the way it did before he worked it harder. He kept a pocket notebook of financial figures for his entire adult life. Production costs, wage rates, inventory numbers. The habit of a man who believed that understanding the arithmetic of a thing was the first step to mastering it. At the 1908 Chicago Auto Show, standing in front of a locomobile on the exhibition floor, he experienced something his biographer later described as mechanical love at first sight. The car cost $5,000. He had $700 in savings, a wife and children to support. He borrowed the remaining $4,300, had the car shipped home by rail, and spent weeks taking it apart and reassembling it in the garage before he ever learned to drive it. He wanted to understand it completely before he operated it. That impulse, to dismantle a thing in order to master it, is the defining fact of his character, and it explains almost everything he built afterward. 3 years later, a banker named James Storrow asked him if he had ever considered automobiles as a career. By then, Chrysler was works manager of the American Locomotive Company in Pittsburgh, earning $8,000 a year and regarded as one of the most effective production minds in the business. He said yes immediately and joined Buick as works manager at $6,000, a pay cut he accepted without hesitation, because he had already decided the automobile was where the next century was going to be made. At Buick, he introduced assembly line processes, restructured the production floor, and tripled daily output from 45 cars to more than 200. He made himself indispensable. By 1916, William Durant had made him president of Buick at $500,000 per year with stock options. He was 41 years old. He had started at $6,000 14 years earlier. The arithmetic of his own rise was the kind he recorded in his pocket notebook and showed to no one. He resigned from General Motors in 1919 over management disputes with Durant, disagreements about production philosophy, spending discipline, and the basic question of who was actually running things. He sold his General Motors stock back to Durant for $10 million and walked out of the largest automobile company in the world. He was 44. He had enough money to retire permanently. He had no intention of retiring. He took a consulting engagement with the failing Willys Overland Company, stabilized it, and turned his attention to an even more troubled operation, Maxwell Chalmers. He reorganized it, stripped out the debt, and introduced a new vehicle in 1924, the Chrysler 6, the first automobile in the world designed with a high-compression engine. That sold so successfully, Maxwell was formally reconstituted as the Chrysler Corporation on June 6, 1925, with Walter Chrysler as chairman and president. In 1928, the same year he bought Reynolds's lease on 42nd Street, he acquired Plymouth and the Dodge Brothers Corporation in a single transaction, making Chrysler Corporation the third largest automaker in America, behind only Ford and General Motors. Time magazine named him Man of the Year. He was 53 years old, one of the most famous men in the country, and known for his directness, his capacity for alcohol, his generosity to old friends from the railroad days who showed up needing work, and his habit of spending lavishly on the people and things he loved. His biographer describes him as a man of genuine warmth who was probably a functioning alcoholic, which were not contradictions so much as a single complicated truth about a man who ran at full speed in every direction at once. He had arrived at the conclusion that a corporation, however large, was not the same as a monument. The Chrysler Corporation was a business. Businesses had shareholders. They had successors. They could be sold, reorganized, merged. What he paid for at 42nd and Lexington, he was building for something different. He registered the building in his own name. He funded construction entirely from his personal accounts. The corporation contributed nothing and owned nothing. He made clear that upon his death, the building would pass to his children. It was not a real estate investment. It was a statement in steel and brick and stainless steel that he intended to outlast him. He had been the fastest man in every room he had ever entered. Now he wanted to build something that would still be in the room long after he was gone. The man he hired to execute that vision had won the Paris Prize in Architecture in 1908, one of the most prestigious awards available to an American architect of that era, and spent 3 years studying at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris under Victor Laloux, whose other students included the architects of Grand Central Terminal. When William Van Alen returned to New York in 1910, he had developed a conviction that American architecture was about to change direction, away from the classical and historical toward something harder-edged and machine-age. More honest about what the 20th century actually was. He was right about the direction, he was wrong about how long he would be recognized as one of its representatives. In 1911, Van Alen formed a partnership with H. Craig Severance. They were complementary in the way partnerships often are before they break apart. Van Alen was introverted and visionary, interested in structural innovation and formal experimentation. Severance was gregarious, commercially astute, and skilled at acquiring clients and managing relationships. A colleague described Van Alen as underscore underscore quote underscore zero underscore underscore. A designer with a showman's instinct who understood that a building, like a performance, had to make you stop walking and look up. For more than a decade, the partnership prospered, becoming known for distinctive commercial structures in Midtown Manhattan. It dissolved acrimoniously in 1924 after an architecture publication praised Van Alen by name while failing to mention Severance at all. The bitterness that followed was total. Lawsuits over clients and firm assets lasted more than a year. By the time the fighting ended, both men were practicing independently, and their professional paths had become a direct competition. Severance was hired to design the Manhattan Trust Building at 40 Wall Street, and Van Alen, freed from the conservatism Severance had always applied to his more extravagant instincts, was commissioned for the building at 42nd and Lexington. The press promoted the rivalry between the former partners, with the pleasure of an audience watching a grudge match. Both buildings were publicly described as potential holders of the world's tallest title. Severance, whose building was progressing steadily, believed he was going to win. Van Alen redesigned the crown continuously through late 1928 and into 1929. The automotive decorative program was Walter Chrysler's insistence and his contribution to the building's architectural program. The structure should celebrate the industry that had generated the fortune funding it. On the 31st floor, winged radiator caps modeled on the Mercury hood ornament, stylized, geometric, unmistakably machine-age ornament rendered at architectural scale. On the 61st floor, 8 American Eagle gargoyles projecting over the streets below, each one modeled on the 1929 Plymouth hood ornament and fabricated by the artist Chesley Bonestell in stainless steel. Hubcap friezes ran along the setbacks. Mudguard motifs appeared in the brickwork detailing. An entire decorative vocabulary derived from the automobile, translated into a material the automobile industry had not yet thought to use at this scale. The crown itself was 7 radiating, terraced arches, a cruciform groin vault built in concentric setbacks mounting one behind another toward the needle. The entire surface clad in Krupp's Neurasta austenitic stainless steel, a German alloy marketed under the trade name Enduro Ka2, developed specifically to resist corrosion without painting or maintenance, deployed here for the first time at the scale of a skyscraper crown, ribbed and riveted in a radiating sunburst pattern. Rows of triangular vaulted windows ascending tier by tier toward the apex. The whole thing engineered to catch light from every angle and return it to the city, a surface that would read differently at dawn, at noon, at dusk, and in the dark. Construction began formally on January 21, 1929. The foundation excavation went down 69 feet through Manhattan schist. Workers laid approximately 3,826,000 bricks by hand, each one part of a non-load-bearing skin stretched over the steel skeleton. Nearly 400,000 rivets were driven into the frame. The construction pace was 4 floors per week, a rate that compressed the build to 16 months. In an era when working on steel above the city killed men regularly, not a single worker died during the construction of the Chrysler Building. The engineers who managed it considered that fact a point of pride. They noted explicitly. The spire was the decisive act. Van Alen had the 4 sections fabricated from Neurasta steel and transported to the site, then assembled in complete secrecy on the 65th floor, out of sight of the street and of any observer Severance might have sent. When Severance's Manhattan Trust Building at 40 Wall Street reached its full completed height in October of 1929, he announced it publicly as the new tallest structure in the world. He had calculated correctly against every design document he had access to. On October 23, 1929, 1 week after the Chrysler Building had surpassed the Woolworth Building in height, and 1 day before the Wall Street crash began, Van Alen's team lowered the bottom spire section through the open dome and raised the remaining 3 sections in sequence. The operation took 90 minutes. Severance had no opportunity to respond. His building was finished. He could not add a single inch. Van Alen watched from the street as the spire rose. He later said it was like watching a butterfly leave its cocoon. The Chrysler Building reached 1,046 feet and claimed the title of tallest structure on Earth, surpassing the Eiffel Tower, the day before the crash that would end the era that made it possible. The building opened formally on May 27, 1930. By June, 65% of its space was already under lease. By August, it was declared structurally complete, though the New York City Department of Construction did not officially record the completion until February of 1932. It was the first man-made structure to exceed 1,000 feet. For 11 months, until the Empire State Building surpassed it in April of 1931, it was the tallest thing human beings had ever constructed. The lobby was triangular, connecting 3 street entrances, and it communicated the building's intentions immediately. African red granite ran along the walls. Amber onyx occupied the corner transitions. Red Moroccan marble covered the floors. Chrome steel ornamentation framed every surface. On the ceiling, 40 feet above the floor, a mural painted directly onto the surface in oil by the artist Edward Trumbull, titled Transport and Human Endeavor, depicting the Chrysler Building itself ascending above a New York being remade by machines and industry. The original tenants on the ground floor included a Chrysler automobile showroom occupying the first 2 levels, the product that had funded the monument, displayed at its own base. Above the lobby, the building operated as several distinct worlds stacked vertically, each one defined by who was allowed into it and what it cost to enter. Walter Chrysler maintained a private apartment near the building's crown. He visited occasionally, entertained there when it suited him, and used it primarily as an address to show clients and associates the view. He had an estate at Kings Point on Long Island that he preferred for actual living. He was known to note with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had grown up in a 2-room house in Kansas that he now possessed the highest toilet in Manhattan. It was not a boast he made earnestly. It was the kind of joke a self-made man makes to remind himself how far the arithmetic had run. 3 floors below Chrysler's private rooms, something considerably more populated was operating. On floors 66 through 68, the Cloud Club had opened with the building in 1930. Designed by Van Alen himself as the building's signature social institution. 3 rooms arranged in deliberately different styles, a futurist main dining room with clean geometric lines, a Tudor lounge that invoked the English country house, and an old English grill room centered on a wood-paneled bar that had been engineered specifically to conceal alcohol during Prohibition. Members could store their preferred spirits in personal lockers and retrieve them when they arrived for lunch. A barbershop occupied one corner. A humidor ran along one wall. The club opened its membership rolls to 300 of New York's most prominent businessmen. Women were not admitted for decades. The founding members included Pan Am's founder Juan Trippe, the publisher Condé Nast, the heavyweight boxer Gene Tunney, and Walter Chrysler himself, who maintained a private dining room within the club. At the time of its opening, the Cloud Club was the highest private dining room in the world. The New York Times would later describe it as the inspiration for every executive dining club that came after it. To have lunch at the Cloud Club in 1932, in the depths of the Depression, while the street below was full of men who had lost everything, was to occupy a particular position in the city's social geography that no other address in New York could replicate. 5 floors below the Cloud Club, the Celestial Observatory opened the building to anyone willing to pay. The 71st floor held 3,900 square feet of public observation space, decorated with planets, stars, and rockets. A cosmological theme that placed the visitor at the top of the world and suggested the universe continued above them. The admission price was 50 cents. On clear days, the visible horizon extended 40 miles in every direction. For 15 years after the building opened, any New Yorker with 2 quarters could stand at the highest publicly accessible point in the Western Hemisphere and look out at everything their city had become. And on the 61st floor, between the Eagle gargoyles and the upper office floors, a photographer named Margaret Bourke-White had decided to make her studio. Bourke-White had been commissioned by the Chrysler Corporation to document the building's construction as it rose through 1929 and 1930. She was a staff photographer for Fortune magazine, The financial publication launched in 1930 to cover American business with visual seriousness, earning $12,000 per year and already known for industrial photography that brought the formal attention of portraiture to the subject of machines. When construction brought her to the 61st floor and she saw the stainless steel eagle gargoyles being bolted into position, each one projecting over 42nd Street 800 feet below, she made a decision that settled the matter. This was where her New York studio would be. There was no point considering anything else. The building's management declined to rent to a woman. Her employer, Time Incorporated, co-signed the lease and vouched for her financial reliability. She paid $387.92 per month. Her friend, the industrial designer John Vassos, designed an art moderne interior for the space. Extensive built-ins, a subdued palette of woods and metals, a central sitting area, a dedicated desk alcove, and a staircase that led out to the terrace. She installed a fish tank suspended above the bar. She kept 2 pet alligators on the terrace, outdoors in the New York weather, and named the 2 nearest gargoyles Min and Bill. She regularly climbed out onto the eagles themselves to photograph the city. 800 feet above the street, with no safety equipment beyond her own nerve and her obvious indifference to the distance below her. In 1934, her darkroom assistant photographed her perched on the back of one of the gargoyles with her large-format camera, the city arranged in every direction below her. The image was published in Life magazine on January 1st of that year. It became one of the defining photographs of the Art Deco period, simultaneously an image of a building and an image of a woman who had claimed the building's most forbidden vantage point as her own working space. The building's management had refused to rent to her on the grounds of her gender. Time Incorporated had co-signed her lease because a woman's name alone was not sufficient. The most famous photograph associated with the Chrysler Building for the century that followed was made by that woman from a ledge she was not officially supposed to access, of a city she had occupied entirely on her own terms. Walter Chrysler had built the tallest private monument in the world. He visited occasionally. He preferred Long Island. By 1935, Chrysler had stepped back from the presidency of the corporation that bore his name, remaining on the board as chairman, but removing himself from daily operations. He was 60 years old. The work that had defined his life, the constant problem-solving, the production floors, the financial restructuring, the competitive maneuvering, had been handed to other hands. He still appeared at formal occasions. He still traveled. He still maintained the gregarious social presence of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms full of people who needed to trust him quickly. When he returned to cities where he had lived decades earlier, Ellis, Kansas, Flint, Michigan, he was met with the warmth reserved for men who had not forgotten where they came from. He played marbles with old friends from the railroad days on his visits back to Ellis. He wrote checks to people who needed them. He found positions at the corporation for acquaintances who asked. He kept his pocket notebook. His marriage to Della Forker had lasted since 1901. She was the daughter of a family he had known in Ellis, his childhood sweetheart in the literal sense. They had been children together on the Kansas plains. She had followed him through every relocation: Salt Lake City, Denver, Cheyenne, Pittsburgh, Flint, New York. She had managed 4 children and the domestic structure of a life that moved constantly. Chrysler credited her in his autobiography and in private conversation as the stable fact around which his ambition had been able to function. Without Della, the biographer suggests, the restlessness would have had no center. In May of 1938, Chrysler suffered a stroke at Forker House, his estate at Kings Point on Long Island. He was 63 years old. 2 months later, in late June, Della died of a cerebral hemorrhage at 58. He had known her since they were children in Frontier, Kansas, and now she was gone before him, quickly, without warning. His biographer records what followed without embellishment. A depressed Walter Chrysler began to waste away. He had taken apart a locomotive to understand its valves. He had taken apart an automobile industry, rebuilt it, and handed it to the country. He had no mechanism for what was happening to him now. The pocket notebook was still there. The figures no longer helped. He died on August 18, 1940, of a second cerebral hemorrhage at Forker House. He was 65 years old. Honorary pallbearers at his funeral included Juan Tripe and Alfred P. Sloan, the men who had competed with him, admired him, and understood what his generation had built. His estate was valued at approximately $8,800,000. The four children, Thelma, Bernice, Walter Jr., and Jack, each received approximately one quarter. The building at 42nd and Lexington was not part of that estate valuation. It had been registered separately, as he had always intended, and passed to his heirs as a distinct inheritance. It was still standing. The name was still on it in stainless steel and brick. It was still the most recognized crown on the skyline of the city he had chosen as his arena. 13 years later, his children sold it. $840,000. That was William Van Alen's invoice, presented to Walter Chrysler in the spring of 1930, when the building had opened and the work was done. 6% of the $14 million construction budget, the standard architectural fee of the era, the figure that any client engaging any architect for any significant commission would have expected to pay. Van Alen sent the invoice. Chrysler refused the balance. What came next was not merely a dispute about money. Chrysler went further. He accused Van Alen publicly of having accepted kickbacks and bribes from building contractors and subcontractors during the course of construction. Allegations that the corruption had inflated the construction costs and that Van Alen had personally enriched himself through the inflation. The accusations were unproven. They were never substantiated by any investigation or proceeding. They were widely reported in the architecture press and the general newspapers. Because the most famous architect in New York being accused of fraud by the most famous client in the city was exactly the kind of story that travels. Van Alen had made the foundational professional error of never formalizing a written contract with Chrysler before construction began. He had proceeded on the basis of a working relationship and the understood conventions of the industry. In June of 1930, he filed a mechanics lien and a lawsuit against the Chrysler Building Corporation, claiming $725,500 remained outstanding after partial payments had been made. Chrysler fought it. The case moved toward settlement. In 1931, it was resolved out of court. Van Alen received his full fee. The money arrived. Nothing else did. The Great Depression had simultaneously eliminated the market for new skyscraper construction. The international style, the unornamented functionalist modernism being promoted by figures including Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, had arrived in America and was redefining architectural seriousness. Everything Van Alen had built was suddenly the wrong kind of building. Louis Mumford, the most prominent architectural critic of the era, dismissed the Chrysler Building as inane romanticism. The bribery allegations had severed Van Alen's professional relationships within the New York architectural community before the lawsuit was even resolved. The combination of depression, shifting taste, and professional scandal was total. Not one combination could have ended his career cleanly. All three together left nothing to recover. By the mid-1930s, he had withdrawn almost entirely from prominent design work. He maintained a modest office at 139 East 52nd Street, close enough to the skyline he had shaped to see it from the street. He took consulting engagements on buildings other men designed. His name appeared in industry publications with decreasing frequency, and then only occasionally, and then not at all for years at a time. He shifted his focus to teaching sculpture at the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design in New York. He was good at it, by all accounts. Students responded to his precision and his willingness to explain exactly why a form worked the way it did. The institute was later renamed the Van Alen Institute in his honor. His name was given to a building he had no part in designing, which is a specific kind of recognition that arrives when an institution has decided to honor a man's legacy rather than his present capacity. The crown lighting he had specified in his 1930 drawings, 580 fluorescent tubes installed within the triangular windows of the spire, illuminating the stainless steel from inside, was never installed during his lifetime. For 51 years, the building stood against the Manhattan sky with its crown unlit, as its architect had intended, visible as a silhouette, but never as the luminous object Van Alen had designed. Van Alen died on May 24, 1954, in Cold Spring, New York. He is buried at Cold Spring Cemetery in Putnam County. He had designed the first super-tall skyscraper in human history, the most formally inventive crown on the New York skyline, the defining example of an architectural movement that would not receive its proper critical rehabilitation for another 2 decades. The Chrysler Building was the summit of his work, the beginning and the absolute end of his career as a significant architect. The spire he designed finally lit up on a September evening in 1981. He had been dead for 27 years. The building had not noticed his absence. In 1953, 13 years after Walter Chrysler died at Forker House, his children did what children often do with monuments their parents built for them. They sold it. The buyer was a real estate developer named William Zeckendorf, who had been reshaping the New York property market for a decade and had a particular appetite for landmark assets. The terms of the sale were not widely reported. The Chrysler name remained on the facade. The family connection was severed. The Chrysler Corporation, which had occupied offices in the building since its opening and had served as its most prominent tenant, relocated elsewhere during the mid-1950s. The corporation that gave the building its name, whose brand identity was woven into every gargoyle and hubcap frieze and stainless steel ornament on the facade, moved out within 25 years of the building's completion. The name stayed. The connection it implied had ended. In 1957, a real estate attorney named Lawrence Wien and a syndicate of investors acquired the building through a structure Wien had pioneered. A public investment arrangement in which hundreds of individual participants pooled funds to purchase a beneficial interest in a single large property. It was, in its basic structure, a precursor to what the industry would later formalize as the Real Estate Investment Trust. Wien had used the approach successfully on other New York landmarks. He applied it to the Chrysler Building and moved it out of the single-family ownership model Walter Chrysler had originally envisioned. In 1960, the building changed hands again, acquired by two investors named Alex DiLorenzo and Sol Goodman. They financed the purchase with a $29 million first mortgage and a $15 million second mortgage, a debt structure that assumed continued strong occupancy and a stable commercial real estate market. For a decade, the assumption held. Then New York changed. The city's fiscal crisis, which accumulated through the early 1970s and peaked in 1975 when New York came within hours of defaulting on its municipal debt, cascaded through the commercial property market. Companies contracted their office footprints. Tenants did not renew leases at previous rates. Vacancy rates climbed across Midtown. The Chrysler Building, aging and no longer the most modern or efficient option available to corporate tenants shopping for space, where Howard Puerto reached approximately 17% vacant. DiLorenzo and Goodman, servicing two mortgages against a building that was not generating enough income to cover them, could no longer pay either. Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company moved in and acquired all outstanding debt on the building for $35 million, less than the combined face value of the two mortgages it was absorbing. The building that had cost Walter Chrysler $20 million to construct from a bare foundation in 1929 had changed hands in distress for $35 million 45 years later. Adjusted for inflation, the 1929 construction cost would have been worth well over $100 million by 1975. The arithmetic of the distress sale told the story of how far the asset had fallen. The following year, the federal government designated the Chrysler Building a National Historic Landmark. In 1978, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission declared both the facade and the lobby interior protected landmarks. The official recognition arrived at the precise moment the building's financial position had just barely stabilized after its deepest crisis. The institutions that certify historical importance tend to move on a different schedule from the markets that establish price. Massachusetts Mutual announced a $23 million renovation in 1978. Mayor Ed Koch attended the press conference and declared that the steel eagles and the gargoyles of the Chrysler Building were all shouting the Renaissance of New York. He was not wrong about the city. He may not have known what was happening inside the building behind him. The renovation had a quieter interior agenda than its public announcement suggested. The Cloud Club, which had operated on floors 66 through 68 since the building opened in 1930, 49 years of New York's most powerful men lunching at the highest private address in the world, Through Prohibition and the Depression and the war and the post-war boom and the long troubled decade just ending, was gutted. The futurist dining room, the Tudor lounge, the Old English grill with its concealed bar and its personal spirit lockers, the humidor, the barber shop, the private dining room where Walter Chrysler had sat with Juan Trippe and Condé Nast and Gene Tunney. All of it demolished and replaced with standard subdivided office space, because standard office space was what the building needed to generate the income the renovation was designed to support. The highest lunch club in the world was dismantled to make the building more profitable. That is the way most things built for pleasure end. Massachusetts Mutual sold the building to Jack Kent Cooke in 1979. Cooke was an entrepreneur who had built a business empire spanning sports franchises, cable television, and real estate, and who acquired the Chrysler Building when it was 96% occupied and returning to stability. He commissioned a spire restoration between 1995 and 1996, a $1.5 million project that polished the joints on the former observation deck, replaced damaged steel strips in the needle, and re-welded sections of the gargoyles that had loosened over 6 decades. The project received the New York Landmarks Conservancy's Lucy G. Moses Preservation Award in 1997. More significantly, Cooke oversaw the first realization of Van Alen's original crown lighting design. In September of 1981, 580 fluorescent tubes were installed within the triangular windows of the building's tiered crown and switched on for the first time. The stainless steel sunburst lit from inside. The triangular windows glowed against the Manhattan night. The needle caught the light above the city. Whatever Van Alen had imagined in 1930 when he specified the lighting in his drawings, this was it. Arriving 51 years and 27 years after his death into the building's history, the building had been waiting half a century to be seen the way its architect intended. It turned out to have been worth waiting for. Cooke died in April of 1997. His mortgage lender, Fuji Bank, announced its intent to foreclose the following month. 20 potential buyers submitted bids for the Chrysler Building and the adjacent properties. In November of 1997, Tishman Speyer Properties and the Travelers Insurance Group won the bidding at approximately $220 million. What Tishman Speyer negotiated alongside the purchase price was the structural element that would define every subsequent transaction involving the building. Cooper Union still owned the land, as it had since 1902. It had always owned the land. Any occupant of the building had always paid Cooper Union rather than the city for the right to build and operate there. Tishman Speyer formalized this into a 150-year ground lease, with the rent initially set at a level that made the $220 million acquisition price financially rational. The lease was contractually scheduled to escalate steeply in structured increments over the following decades. It was set to run until 2147. In 1998, Tishman Speyer spent $100 million on renovations. Among the most significant, the art restoration firm Evergreen Architectural Arts was commissioned to uncover and restore Trumbull's Transport and Human Endeavor ceiling mural in the lobby, which had been painted over during the late 1970s renovation as though it were a liability rather than an asset. The ceiling was returned to its 1930 condition. The building reached 95% occupancy by 2005. In 2001, a 75% ownership stake was sold to TMW, the German arm of an Atlanta-based investment fund, for $300 million, a transaction that valued the full asset at $400 million and confirmed the building's recovery as a trophy property. In 2007, the American Institute of Architects ranked the Chrysler Building 9th on its list of America's favorite architecture. The critical dismissal that had followed Van Alen's career into his grave had been fully reversed. The building he designed as a commercial showpiece for an automobile manufacturer's personal ambition was now regarded as a paragon of its era, the defining statement of a style, an object of genuine architectural love. In June of 2008, the Abu Dhabi Investment Council, the sovereign wealth fund of the United Arab Emirates, paid $800 million to acquire a 90% stake in the building. $800 million for a leasehold on a building occupying land owned by a college in Manhattan. The transaction valued the total asset at roughly $890 million and established the all-time peak valuation of the Chrysler Building. Tishman Speyer retained 10% and continued managing the property, paying Cooper Union $7.5 million per year in ground rent at the rates then in effect. 2008 was also the year the global financial crisis began. The Abu Dhabi Investment Council held the asset through a decade of accumulating difficulties. Remote work began its slow structural expansion into corporate culture. Midtown Manhattan's office market shifted as companies reconsidered the relationship between headcount and square footage. The Chrysler Building's upper floors, where the floor plates narrowed to sub-4,000 square feet in the tiered sections of the crown, became harder to lease at premium rates. The building's systems were aging, the address remained iconic, the underlying economics were eroding. By 2019, the Abu Dhabi Investment Council and Tishman Speyer were ready to exit. The ground rent obligation was about to escalate dramatically under the terms of the lease renegotiated in 2006. No buyer was going to pay near $800 million for a building whose carrying costs were about to jump sharply and whose floor plans presented structural leasing challenges. 20 buyers had competed for the asset in 1997. In 2019, the field was considerably thinner. In March of 2019, A.B. Rosen's RFR Holding, in a joint venture with the Austrian investment firm Signa Group, led by René Benko, purchased the leasehold for $151 million. The price represented approximately 83% below the 2008 peak. A building appraised at $14 million when it opened had been purchased at its height for $800 million and sold, you may quote 11 years later, for roughly what Walter Chrysler had spent constructing it from the ground up in $1929. The ground rent Rosen inherited was not the rate Tishman Speyer had paid at acquisition. Under the terms of the 2006 lease renegotiation, the annual payment escalated immediately upon the 2019 sale from $7,750,000 per year to $32,500,000 per year. It was contractually scheduled to rise to $41 million by 2028 and to $55 million by 2038. A.B. Rosen told reporters after the transaction closed, within 5 years, he would lose it entirely. Rosen's ambitions for the property were not unreasonable in their conception. He announced plans to convert the building to a hotel. The small upper floor plates that challenged conventional office use were better suited to hospitality. He wanted to restore high-floor dining to the 66th through 68th floors in the spirit of the old Cloud Club, bringing restaurants back to the building's upper reaches after 40 years of absence. He proposed an observation deck on the 61st floor setback near the Eagle gargoyles, allowing the public to experience the building's exterior from the height of the Eagles for the first time. The Landmarks Preservation Commission approved the observation deck proposal in May of 2020. The hotel conversion was abandoned in April of 2019, weeks after the acquisition closed, when it became clear that the ground lease created legal complications that made hospitality conversion impractical. The observation deck, though approved by the Landmarks Commission, was never built. The Cloud Club space on the 66th through 68th floors was occupied by AMA Capital Partners, a shipping industry bank, and was unavailable for the restoration Rosen had described. Then the pandemic arrived and removed nearly every office worker in Manhattan from the buildings they had occupied. Rosen invested more than $100 million in the property over the following years, attempting to cover rent shortfalls and fund infrastructure improvements, while the office market worked its way through an uncertain recovery. His Austrian partner, René Benko's Signa Group, entered bankruptcy proceedings in 2023 and was court-ordered to sell its stake in the building. RFR simultaneously faced foreclosure actions on multiple other New York properties. 522 Fifth Avenue, where it had defaulted on $224 million in debt. 475 Fifth Avenue, where it had defaulted on $180 million. Retail properties at 1 Jackson Square and 219 East 67th Street. The pattern of distress was not isolated to the Chrysler Building, but the Chrysler Building was where it became most legible to the public. In May of 2024, RFR stopped paying ground rent to Cooper Union. On September 27, 2024, Cooper Union formally declared the ground lease terminated and announced that Cushman and Wakefield had been retained to manage the property directly. By that point, RFR owed $21 million in unpaid rent. Rosen filed a lawsuit to halt the takeover, initially arguing that Cooper Union had made procedural errors in filing its termination notice. In an amended complaint, he alleged that Cooper Union's management of campus protests related to the conflict in Gaza had caused tenants to cancel or decline to renew leases in the Chrysler Building, costing RFR the income it needed to pay its rent obligations. He named no specific tenants. He provided no documentation. Cooper Union's Vice President of Finance, John Ruth, responded in a public statement, quote underscore 5, underscore. In January of 2025, New York Civil Court Judge Jennifer Schechter ruled in Cooper Union's favor. Reviewing RFR's various defenses, she said, quote underscore 6, underscore RFR was evicted from the building. At the time of the ruling, the Chrysler Building was 100% occupied by tenants. Cooper Union now controls the asset. Savills has been retained to find a new leaseholder. The asking price has not been disclosed publicly, but is expected to substantially exceed the 2019 fire sale figure. The ground rent obligation stands at $32,500,000 per year, escalating to $41 million by 2028. Every prospective buyer is reviewing the same arithmetic that has defeated every occupant since the building opened. The arithmetic traces back to 1859, when Peter Cooper arranged for a school to be funded by the ground it stood on, and to 1902, when his descendants chose a corner in what would become Midtown Manhattan as the permanent endowment. The lobby is accessible to the public on weekdays between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening, free of charge. Trumbull's ceiling mural is visible, restored to its 1930 condition. The Moroccan marble and the amber onyx and the chrome steel are intact. The gargoyles project over 42nd Street as they have since the building opened. The spire illuminates from inside each night, as Van Alen specified, and as Cook's engineers first realized in 1981. What occupies the interior of the spire above the triangular windows? The space inside the crown that the stainless steel makes appear so full of purpose is largely concrete and structural infrastructure. Moses Gates, an urban explorer who has documented the building's less visited spaces, found that the inside of the most celebrated crown in the American skyline contains primarily the building's mechanical support. The fantasy is entirely on the outside. It always was. That is not a disappointing discovery. A building that produces awe entirely through its exterior is doing something most buildings spend their whole existence trying and failing to do. Everything important about the Chrysler Building has always been on the outside. William Reynolds walked away with $2.5 million and no credit. He dreamed the project, commissioned the architect, and ran out of money before the ground was properly broken. Van Alen designed the crown and the gargoyles and the sunburst spire and spent the remaining 24 years of his life teaching sculpture 12 blocks north of the building he could see from his office window. He won the lawsuit. He never recovered. The lighting he specified in his original drawings was activated 27 years after he died. Walter Chrysler built the building for his children. His children sold it. Though Chrysler Corporation, the company whose identity is inscribed in every architectural detail of the facade, vacated its offices within a generation and moved its operations elsewhere. The Cloud Club, 49 years of New York's most powerful men conducting the city's business over lunch at the highest private table in the world, was demolished in a renovation and replaced by standard office space. Its successor today is a bank that finances shipping. The Celestial Observatory, where any New Yorker could stand at the highest publicly accessible point on Earth for 50 cents, closed in 1945, was gutted for office use. Was at some point converted into a private workspace for approximately 8 people, and is now occupied by a firm that does not advertise its presence there. Margaret Bourke-White kept her alligators on the 61st floor terrace, named the gargoyles Min and Bill, climbed onto them 800 feet above the city without safety equipment, and produced the photograph that more people associate with the Chrysler Building than any image made since. She was there for 3 years. Her employer had to co-sign her lease because the building would not rent to a woman. Abu Dhabi paid $800 million at the peak and sold 11 years later for $151 million. A.B. Rosen called it Sleeping Beauty and was evicted for $21 million in unpaid rent to a college. Cooper Union has owned the ground since 1902. In every transaction across a century, at every price and through every ownership structure, they have collected. The school that teaches people to design and build things is the only entity in the building's history that has never lost money on it. They did not build it. They only owned the dirt. The spire went up in 90 minutes. Everything else has taken longer and cost more and ended in ways no one anticipated at the moment they believed the building was finally theirs. The building stands through all of it, indifferent to the names on the deed, catching light from every angle and returning it to the city below, exactly as the architect intended, exactly as it has since the September evening in 1981 when someone finally switched on the lights. Somewhere in Manhattan right now, someone is looking up at the sunburst crown of the Chrysler Building and deciding it is the most beautiful thing they have ever seen. They have never heard of William Reynolds. They do not know Van Alen's name. They could not tell you who holds the lease this month, or what the ground rent escalates to in 2028, or what a civil court judge said in January of 2025. They just know the building. That was always enough. The building was never about the people who owned it. It was about everyone who looked up.